In every age, love was praised as divine, but when that love crossed boundaries, it became a death sentence. Imagine a moonlit courtyard in an ancient city. A woman stands trembling before a silent crowd. Her wrists are bound with rough rope, her hair tangled by the wind. Around her, torches flicker, casting red light over stone walls and judgmental faces. Somewhere behind her stands her husband, not as lover, but as executioner. The crime is adultery, not betrayal of a man, but defiance of a system that claimed ownership of her desire. In that world, passion was not private, it was property. To love beyond permission meant to die for it. And death was not enough, it had to be seen, felt, and remembered. From ancient Babylon to medieval Europe, the punishment for adultery was never just about sin, it was about control. Blood was spilled to preserve honor, bones broken to uphold purity. Across continents and centuries, the same question echoed: why did societies fear a woman's love more than her death? Tonight, we descend into history's cruelest judgment, where betrayal met fire, stone, and silence. Long before adultery became a crime, it was a story of love, temptation, and consequence. But as civilization grew, stories turned into laws, and emotions became crimes punishable by death. Ancient rulers realized something powerful. Controlling desire meant controlling people. Love, once sacred, became a threat to order. And so began the long history of moral vengeance. In ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest written laws carved into stone. The Code of Hammurabi treated adultery as treason. A woman caught with another man was to be bound and thrown into a river, her fate left to the gods. The husband could pardon her, but only if he wished to share her shame. The message was clear: fidelity was not moral, it was ownership. A woman's body was the vessel of lineage, property of the man who owned her. Her betrayal threatened bloodlines, inheritance, and pride. In ancient Israel, morality was divine law. The Old Testament decreed that adulterers be stoned before the congregation. The ritual was public and precise: the first stone cast by the witnesses, the rest by the community. This spectacle transformed punishment into purification. Blood washed away impurity, restoring divine order. Yet even here, the weight of sin fell unequally. Men could seek forgiveness, women became symbols of corruption. The ancient Greeks offered no mercy either. Their myths spoke of jealous gods and vengeful husbands. In Athens, an adulterous woman lost all legal rights. She could not marry again, enter temples, or testify in court. Her voice, like her body, was silenced forever. Meanwhile, her husband could parade mistresses openly without consequence. In Greek tragedy, the adulteress was always punished not because of her crime, but because her desire challenged male authority. The Romans, masters of law, perfected hypocrisy. Under Augustus, adultery was declared a crime against the state. The emperor's own daughter, Julia, was exiled for violating moral codes that he himself ignored. Punishments varied from exile to execution, but the purpose remained constant: to make women living examples of discipline. The male ego was protected by the public destruction of female desire. Across ancient Asia, similar beliefs thrived. In China's Han Dynasty, Confucian teachings bound women to absolute obedience. An adulterous wife disgraced not just herself, but her ancestors. She could be divorced, imprisoned, or forced into suicide to cleanse the family name. Love was not romantic, it was political. A wife's loyalty preserved harmony. Her rebellion threatened the empire's moral fabric. In India, morality merged with mysticism. The laws of Manusmriti condemned female infidelity as a sin worse than theft or murder. A wife's virtue defined her husband's honor and her family's status. Even the whisper of disloyalty brought exile, mutilation, or death. Over centuries, this ideology evolved into rituals like sati, where widows were burned alive on their husbands' pyres. Though often justified as devotion, it carried echoes of punishment. The woman who outlived her husband risked suspicion, her very existence seen as potential impurity. What united all these civilizations was fear not of sin, but of disorder. Adultery threatened social hierarchy. If a woman could choose, love could replace obedience, and if passion defied law, the system itself might unravel. Thus, kings, priests, and lawmakers transformed moral codes into weapons. Religion sanctified cruelty, law enforced it, and society applauded it. Love became dangerous because it was human. Desire could not be taxed, owned, or regulated. And so rulers redefined it. Love was divine when obedient, sinful when free. The most intimate act became political theatre, a declaration of loyalty or rebellion. By the time the medieval world emerged, these laws had solidified into unquestioned truths. Women were taught that virtue was survival. Fear became education, and purity became the currency of safety. From the banks of the Tigris to the temples of Rome, one message echoed through centuries: passion without permission must end in pain. In making love illegal, civilizations ensured control would outlive compassion. And once fear became law, mercy had no place to breathe. Adultery was not just punished, it was performed. Across empires and centuries, execution for infidelity became a ritual, a public act of purification through pain. These were not private sentences whispered behind palace walls. They were ceremonies of terror, where communities gathered to witness morality restored by blood. Death was not simply justice, it was theatre, and the woman's body was both the stage and the message. In ancient Mesopotamia, execution by drowning carried divine symbolism. Adulterers were bound together, man and woman, their bodies tied with rope and cast into the river. The waters were said to decide their guilt if they sank. The gods had judged them. Crowds lined the riverbanks as the condemned gasped for air, their last moments framed as sacred justice. The ritual purified not only the law, but the community's conscience. The horror was communal, and that made it powerful. In ancient Israel, stoning transformed sin into spectacle. The condemned woman was led to a public square, her body wrapped in white cloth, symbolizing both purity and death. The first stone was thrown by the witnesses, a moral obligation that forced accusers to become executioners. Then came the crowd, wave after wave of stones raining down until breath and beauty were crushed beneath rubble. Each impact was meant to remind onlookers, sin brings ruin, and defiance deserves extinction. Persian punishments were more elaborate and more cruel. Records describe women buried up to their necks in sand, their faces exposed to the desert sun. Sometimes the executioners would wait until the heat cracked the earth, then pour scalding oil over their heads. In other cases, adulteresses were trampled by horses, each hoofbeat echoing as divine retribution. These acts were staged as moral cleansing, but the real purpose was spectacle, a show of patriarchal power disguised as holiness. In ancient Rome, punishment carried political weight. Elite women accused of adultery were publicly stripped of titles, paraded through streets, and exiled to desolate islands. Common women were less fortunate. Some were flogged naked in public squares, their backs torn open by whips until they collapsed. The pain was only part of the ritual. Humiliation was the true sentence. To be seen, shamed, and silenced was the empire's cruelest justice. In medieval Europe, punishment grew theatrical. Execution was often preceded by confession and procession. Adulteresses were dressed in coarse cloth, their heads shaved, and a noose hung around their necks. In towns across France and Germany, they were forced to walk barefoot through markets as priests shouted prayers for repentance. Spectators jeered, threw rotten food, and spat in their faces. The goal was not just death, it was erasure. The woman's identity, dignity, and humanity were stripped away before her body was. Then came fire. In kingdoms like Spain, Italy, and parts of England, burning became the ultimate punishment for adultery. The condemned woman was tied to a wooden stake, the flames kindled beneath her feet. As smoke filled the air, priests chanted psalms while nobles watched from balconies. The burning body became a sermon, flesh as warning, flame as law. Even the execution smell was described in chronicles as a purification of sin. In the Indian subcontinent, the ritual of sati blurred the line between punishment and devotion. Though not always forced, the practice often masked coercion. A widow accused of unfaithful thoughts or potential betrayal was expected to ascend her husband's funeral pyre. The crowd would gather as she was dressed in silks and garlands, her face calm, her heart terrified. Priests declared her burning a sacred act, but many accounts tell of women pushed back into the fire when instinct drove them to escape. The flames consumed not only her body, but the idea that she could live independently of a man. The Islamic world, too, carried its versions of ritual justice. Under certain interpretations of early Sharia law, adultery could warrant stoning or lashing. Trials were often public, and the moral message unmistakable: private desire was a threat to communal purity. Yet even here, women bore the greater burden of proof, their testimonies discounted, their bodies displayed as lessons in submission. The more societies evolved, the more elaborate these executions became. They were recorded in chronicles, painted in manuscripts, and told as cautionary tales. Monarchs, priests, and poets used them to define virtue. The public learned to equate a woman's death with moral victory. The crowd's cheers masked collective guilt, the relief of watching someone else pay for humanity's forbidden desires. But beneath the smoke and stone, something darker stirred. These rituals revealed more about society than about sin. Adultery was rarely punished to defend marriage, it was punished to defend control. Women's bodies were canvases where patriarchal power painted its authority. By turning execution into theatre, societies made cruelty a tradition and obedience a virtue. Every ritual shared one chilling truth. The punishment was never meant to end with the victim. It was meant to echo in the whispers of those who watched, in the fears of women who loved, and in the laws that followed. The spectacle ensured that the next woman would not dare to feel what the condemned had felt. The crowd dispersed, the ashes cooled, but the memory of fear remained, passed from mother to daughter as quiet instruction. Be faithful, be silent, or be destroyed. Every law, every ritual, every stone cast for adultery shared one unspoken rule. The punishment was made for women. Across empires, from Babylon to Rome, from the Ottoman courts to medieval Europe, men sinned freely, while women died for it. The double standard was not an accident of history, it was a deliberate system built to protect male privilege, masked as moral order. In nearly every civilization, adultery laws were written with bias carved deeper than the chisel marks on their tablets. Under the code of Hammurabi, a married man's affair with an unmarried woman was tolerated, even expected. But if a married woman strayed, no matter the reason, her body became evidence and her life forfeit. Her punishment was public, ritualized, and final. The message was clear: a man's desire expanded his power, a woman's desire destroyed it. In ancient Greece, philosophers spoke of virtue while living contradictions. Men could take lovers, visit courtesans, or keep concubines as signs of virility. But wives existed for one purpose: to bear legitimate heirs. A woman's fidelity protected inheritance. A man's infidelity was irrelevant. The The law reflected this imbalance. Husbands who caught their wives in the act could kill both lovers without consequence. Wives who caught their husbands could do nothing but lower their eyes and remain silent. In Rome, adultery was defined not as betrayal of love, but theft of property. A wife's body belonged to her husband, her virtue an extension of his honor. When she erred, it was considered damage to his reputation, and he was entitled to avenge it. The Emperor Augustus, who himself indulged in numerous affairs, passed moral reforms that made adultery a crime punishable by exile or death. His daughter, Julia, became a public sacrifice to the laws her father broke privately. Her banishment was a performance power reminding everyone that even royal women existed under the shadow of fear. The same pattern unfolded across continents. In Islamic societies, early interpretations of religious law required 4 male witnesses to prove adultery, a standard almost impossible to meet for men, yet devastating for women. Accusations often relied on pregnancy outside marriage, making the woman's own body the evidence of her guilt. The system ensured that women bore both the burden of proof and the consequence of shame. In Confucian China, moral purity was the cornerstone of family honor. A wife's loyalty extended beyond her life. Even suspicion of adultery could result in forced suicide or execution by strangulation. Meanwhile, scholars and emperors maintained harems filled with concubines. These women were denied identity, existing only as ornaments of pleasure. The emperor's infidelity was seen as divine privilege. A woman's passion was her downfall. Europe inherited the same hypocrisy under the cross. The Church preached chastity and fidelity, yet its own clergy often broke their vows. Women were demonized as temptresses, blamed for men's lust, and punished as the source of sin. The story of Eve, her hunger for knowledge, became the eternal justification for control. To ensure order, patriarchal systems taught that a man's weakness was forgivable, but a woman's independence was evil. Even the methods of punishment revealed the imbalance. Men were executed swiftly, decapitation, sword, or exile. Women were shamed, stripped, displayed, and burned. The cruelty was public because it wasn't just about justice, it was about warning. Every woman who watched understood that survival required obedience. Men ruled empires, women learned silence. But beneath the brutality lay the deeper truth, fear disguised as virtue. Societies feared female autonomy, the idea that a woman could choose love, control desire, or defy the hierarchy. Her freedom threatened the lineage that kept kingdoms stable, inheritance predictable, and religion unquestioned. So fear was woven into faith. Laws were written not to punish sin, but to preserve dominance. The body of a woman became a border between order and chaos. Even love could not protect them. In medieval France and England, noble women who fell in love outside arranged marriages were executed for treason. Their love was considered rebellion, their deaths political necessity. Meanwhile, their husbands openly entertained mistresses and fathered illegitimate heirs, celebrated as men of appetite. Love was a privilege reserved for kings. For queens, it was a crime. The hypocrisy endured into later centuries. When the Ottoman Sultan suspected disloyalty in his harem, the accused women were strangled silently with silk cords. Their bodies were dropped into the Bosphorus at night, never to be found. The same Sultan, however, maintained dozens of concubines in his gilded prison. Justice was never blind, it was selective, draped in gold and crowned with cruelty. For ordinary women, the injustice was even worse. Peasant wives accused of adultery faced beatings, branding, or public humiliation. Husbands could punish them privately, invoking household honor as justification. No priest, no magistrate, no God interfered. The law turned cruelty into a husband's right. Why did men survive while women died? because every execution reinforced a hierarchy. The public needed reminders of who held power. A man's transgression was a sin, a woman's was revolution. To destroy her was to restore balance. Even now, history whispers its bias. The records rarely name the men involved, but they immortalize the women's scarlet letters, painted sinners, eternal warnings. They were erased from memory, yet preserved as symbols, punished twice, once by death, again by narrative. The double standard was the most enduring form of power. It ensured that no matter how high a woman rose, her life could still be reduced to accusation. Her virtue, unlike a man's, was not her own. It belonged to her husband, her family, her nation, and to lose it was to lose everything. And so across centuries, one truth remained unbroken. When men sinned, they were forgiven. When women loved, they were destroyed. There was a time when shame was not a feeling, it was a ceremony. Adultery, once whispered in secrecy, became a public performance of morality where humiliation replaced justice. In marketplaces, courtyards, and church squares, punishment for infidelity transformed into a spectacle, one that fed the crowd's hunger for virtue and violence alike. Every punishment began with an announcement. A bell would ring through the town, summoning citizens to witness purification through pain. The accused, most often a woman, was led through the streets barefoot, her hair unbound, a symbol of disgrace. Around her neck hung a placard declaring her crime: adulteress, betrayer, unchaste. She was not a person anymore. She was a warning, her suffering an act of instruction. In medieval France, such processions were called la course d'infamie, the race of shame. The condemned woman was paraded through the city, followed by guards and jeering crowds. She was forced to carry stones, symbols of the ones that could have killed her. Onlookers spat, laughed, and prayed in equal measure. It was not punishment, it was theatre. Each insult, each slap, each tear became part of the script written by fear. In England, humiliation took mechanical form. The cucking stool and the scold's bridle became devices of moral correction. Women accused of infidelity or disobedience were strapped into wooden chairs and dunked into rivers, their screams drowned by laughter. Others wore iron masks with spikes that pressed against their tongues, preventing speech, enforcing silence. The sound of chains clinking and water splashing became background music to the moral order. In Italy and Spain, punishment turned even more ritualistic. Accused adulteresses were wrapped in white shrouds as if already dead and made to confess publicly before priests. The church bells tolled as they were whipped or branded. Onlookers were told it was mercy that public repentance spared the soul. But mercy had never looked so much like spectacle. Even when executions were not carried out, symbolic punishments ensured lifelong humiliation. In parts of Germany, women convicted of adultery had their hair shaved, an act of erasing identity. In Eastern Europe, they were forced to wear iron collars or walk through towns tied to livestock, representing animalistic sin. The body became a billboard of guilt, marked permanently so that forgiveness could never follow. But what made these punishments so effective was not their cruelty, it was their audience. Public shame relied on participation. The community, once passive observers, became active enforcers of morality. Mothers brought their daughters to watch, whispering warnings about obedience. Men shouted to prove loyalty to law and church. Each spectator became part of the system that ensured women would fear disgrace more than death. The church understood this power well. Priests framed these acts as moral purification, preaching that pain cleansed the soul. They compared adulteresses to Eve, their bodies vessels of temptation that had to be subdued. The pulpit and the platform worked hand in hand, sermons on Sunday, punishments on Monday. Holiness required an audience. This theatre of shame was not confined to Europe. In imperial China, women accused of infidelity faced parade punishments. Through crowded streets, their faces painted black with ink. Bamboo signs detailing their crimes hung from their necks, while townspeople hurled insults and rotten food. The punishment was psychological annihilation, a public death without execution. Even in the Ottoman Empire, where executions were more discreet, humiliation thrived inside palace walls. Concubines suspected of betrayal were paraded before the harem, their garments torn as symbols of dishonor. Before strangulation, they were made to kneel before the other women, a spectacle of warning dressed in silence. The goal was always the same: to destroy reputation, because reputation was power. In patriarchal societies, a woman's honor defined her family's standing. To publicly strip her of it was to render her powerless forever. Shame achieved what death could not. It erased influence while keeping the body alive to serve as reminder. The theatre of shame also served a political purpose. Monarchs and clergy alike used it to reinforce authority. Public punishments dramatized the idea that the state and church controlled morality itself. The crowd's participation symbolized consent, the illusion that justice belonged to everyone, when in truth it was owned by the powerful. By turning punishment into entertainment, rulers disguised control as righteousness. And yet the crowd's fascination was not only moral, it was voyeuristic. People came not just to condemn, but to feel. To see beauty destroyed, power humbled, virtue punished, it thrilled something primal. The same societies that outlawed desire fed on its punishment. Shame became a currency of entertainment long before tabloids or screens existed. Over centuries, the ritual evolved but never vanished. When the flames dimmed and the devices rusted, their spirit migrated into words, gossip, and rumor. The scaffold became the whisper. The market crowd became the village circle. The jeers became judgment passed quietly over tea. Shame required no stage, it lived in memory, ready to perform again. The tragedy of these rituals is not only in their cruelty, but in their effectiveness. They worked. Women learned to police themselves, to guard every glance and gesture, fearing not death, but disgrace. The fear of humiliation became internal law, stronger than any written one. The theatre of shame had achieved what centuries of violence could not. It made obedience self-inflicted. History records the sound of the crowd, the tolling of bells, the cries for forgiveness. But what lingers most are the silences that followed the silence of those who watched and said nothing, the silence of those who survived and never spoke again. The theatre may have ended, but the echoes of its applause still ring through time. The pyres have gone cold, the stones have fallen silent. Yet the spirit of those punishments still lingers alive, not in law, but in judgment. The world no longer burns adulterers in the streets, but it still burns reputations in public squares built of screens and headlines. The faces have changed, the rituals have evolved, but the logic remains the same: control through fear, silence through shame. Across centuries, humanity traded the whip for words, the stake for scandal. In the age of the internet, humiliation has become instant and infinite. The crowd no longer gathers in marketplaces, it gathers online. A single accusation, a leaked message, a rumor whispered across social media, and a modern adulteress finds herself standing in a digital arena, her life dissected by strangers. The same voyeurism that once drew townspeople to executions now fuels algorithms. Moral outrage has simply moved platforms. Public shame today hides behind language of morality, loyalty, honor, reputation. Celebrity affairs become international headlines. Private relationships become entertainment. The audience may claim righteousness, but its appetite is unchanged. It demands humiliation disguised as justice. The punishment is psychological, but its reach is total. Ancient societies believed the body must be destroyed to erase desire. Modern ones learn that destroying identity works just as well. Even outside fame, echoes persist. In parts of the world, honor killings still claim lives under the same logic that once fueled stonings and drownings. Families murder daughters, sisters, and wives to restore a reputation that was never theirs to lose. The scene repeats. A woman's choice framed as betrayal, her punishment disguised as duty. The past is not gone, it is just modernized, clothed in new excuses, performed under quieter skies. And where blood is not spilled, silence takes its place. Around the world, women still face exile, isolation, or ostracism for crossing invisible moral boundaries. Divorcees, single mothers, or women labeled unfaithful endure social execution. They are erased from families, communities, and workplaces, living proof that the crowd's cruelty no longer needs flames to kill. The psychology behind it all remains hauntingly familiar. Ancient kings and priests used adultery to control lineage and power. Today, institutions use moral outrage to control narratives. The fear of being shamed keeps people compliant, afraid to live freely. The woman in the medieval square and the woman trending on today's news feed share the same posture, standing alone before a crowd that confuses punishment with purity. Technology has only sharpened the tools. In medieval Europe, punishment ended when the executioner's hand fell still. Now the execution is endless. A video, a photo, a rumor once released cannot die. The crowd's memory is eternal, its outrage renewable. The pyre has become digital, the flames invisible but relentless. Yet in this repetition lies a revelation. Every act of shaming reveals society's fear of women who act without permission. The same fear that built iron masks and invented bridle muzzles now builds moral narratives about fallen women, homewreckers, and disgraced wives. The words have changed, the control has not. But history also offers resistance. For every woman silenced by shame, another refused to kneel. In the archives of forgotten centuries, there are stories of queens who defied kings, wives who escaped punishment, lovers who fled across borders to survive. Their rebellion was not loud, but it endured. The fact that their stories remain written, whispered, resurrected, means that the theatre of fear never achieved its final act. Today the rebellion continues in quieter ways. Each time a woman refuses to hide her story, refuses to apologize for desire, refuses to bear blame alone, she defies centuries of ritualized fear. She stands not only for herself, but for those who were buried, burned, and erased. Every voice raised in defiance is a spark against the old pyre. The irony is bitter, yet clear. The same societies that once killed for adultery now worship passion in art, film, and literature. The forbidden has become romanticized, sanitized, sold back as fantasy. But behind that fascination lies denial. We celebrate love stories, yet ignore the real women destroyed for daring to love. The fascination with sin remains, only the direction of judgment has changed. To look at history's most terrifying punishment for adultery is to face a mirror. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. Do we still punish those who love outside our expectations? Do we still measure women's worth by purity and obedience? Do we still delight in seeing someone humiliated for desire? The answers are rarely comforting. The stones have been replaced by comments. The crowd no longer throws, but types. The executioner wears no hood, he hides behind anonymity. But the pain, the fear, the injustice, all feel the same. The punishment never ended, it only evolved. And yet, there is hope in awareness. History, when told honestly, exposes the lies that sustain cruelty. By remembering the burned, the drowned, and the shamed, we deny the systems that built their pyres. The past warns us. that morality without mercy always becomes violence. When the last torch flickered out in those ancient squares, smoke carried more than the scent of death, it carried a warning. That warning still drifts above us, unseen but waiting to be heard. Every time society destroys a person to protect its purity, it lights the pyre again. The flames may no longer burn flesh, but the smoke has never left.